Yes, that's what I was told. I've been staring him down for the past minute.
On leave is working on a book tentatively titled um, Black, Black Men in the White House. Is that correct? Yeah, Black Men in the White House. So without further ado,
Connecticut, grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, and was raised in a really, really unique household. I was raised by a mother who was conservative and a father who was about as far left as you can get, right, without being an actual anarchist. So, and they're still married to this day. But it taught me a lot about kind of how politics works. I also grew up, I mentioned that I'm from Hartford. I grew up in an area where politics functions very different from national politics. So Hartford is, but on a local level, the partisan affiliations, the partisan politics erases. And so all of a sudden you have issues based on class. You have issues based on neighborhood. You have all of these very different ideas of what it means to be political and apolitical. And so I grew up again with a mother who was conservative and a father who was very, very radical, and seeing them operate in politics and local politics. What it did was it gave me an interest in thinking about things from both from I guess a bipartisan lens, right? So from a lens, or really a political lens from all sides, but also really thinking about people or individuals or political behavior that goes against the grain. So I've always been interested in ideas that cut against the grain and go against the norm or the particulars of what we know. So in undergraduate, I was a history major. I ended up looking at Mary Church Terrell, the Black Women's Club movement and the Black Women's Club movement, but also looking at her political activism as a Republican suffragette, black suffragette in the 1890s through the 1930s, but also looking at the way that politics operated within black communities and black political behavior based along class and color lines. When I got to graduate school, I was really interested in the Garvey movement, Marcus Garvey in the early 1920s, and looking at the Garvey Must Go movement with mainstream civil rights organizations like the NAACP or the National Urban League, or even some of these black socialist movements, and how they banded together in a kind of Pan-African sense in order to unite around getting rid of Marcus Garvey because of the threat that he represented. So I've always been interested in these narratives that are outside the norm or outside of the mainstream of the histories or the politics that we tell ourselves. So when it came time to really think about doing something that could sustain my interest for a book-length project, I originally said, well, I want to do something that melds contemporary politics with history. But I also want to do something that looks at black politics and black behavior and black social life, and really the intersection of these areas. So naturally I thought, well, you know what, I'm going to write a book on Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition, because to me that seemed like something radically different than I had seen other people do, this idea of leverage politics, particularly in the face of, or as a means of pushing the Democratic Party to areas that the Democratic Party wasn't comfortable going. And then somebody wrote that book. So if you're a historian, the worst thing that can happen to you is somebody writes your book as you are writing it. So I thought, oh great, I can't write this book. But I had come across a document that I couldn't make heads or tails of. So I just kind of put aside and said, I'm not going to deal with this. But I'd been told by an advisor the best kind of history and the best kind of, so this was the start, I think, of something that was really intriguing to me and that was something that was sustainable, not just for a book, but really for potentially a career of study. I went big thinking that I wouldn't find very much because weren't Republicans, right, or weren't supposed to be Republicans. But then I also knew that, you know what, the evidence in front of us is telling us something completely different. And so when I went big and I started looking into the archives, I found thousands of documents. At last count, I'm up to about 8.
Participation, involvement in the Republican Party prior to, let's say, about Eisenhower, Nixon.
So I think people come into this, and part of the really fascinating part about working on race and politics and partisanship is that everybody comes into this thinking that they know every story is radically different from anything that we had imagined. And that really, through 1964, African Americans, in very large numbers, the narrative that we see is that 1936, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is hot on the heels of the success of the New Deal. African Americans hadn't supported him during the New Deal. They had instead had been stalwart in their support for the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. But in 1936, because of the advances in particular areas, African Americans overwhelmingly vote for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. One of the things that I discovered, but not the Democratic Party as a party. Now, if we think about it more broadly, this makes sense because why? They're still Southern Democrats, Southern segregationists. And so we see these moments where African Americans are moving in and out of the Republican Party and doing so in very flexible ways. One is the desegregation of the armed forces, right? Truman's desegregation of the armed forces. But also, two, Southern Democrats break off as punishment, right? Punishing the Democratic Party for their civil rights stance, break off and form a third-party movement, right? The Dixiecrats. And so ultimately what happens is that gives African Americans the room to affiliate much more broadly with the Democratic Party. And yet they still affiliate with the Republican Party at the same time. And in particular, this holds true to this day. When African Americans, the Democratic Party, back and forth, Richard Nixon gets a roughly third error. So it may have been lower, it may have been slightly higher, it probably was lower, but there is this mass exodus out of the party.
Goldwater, who was a strong proponent of individual rights in the Constitution, and the conservative movement, large chunks of the conservative movement, wind up being on the wrong side of this issue.
So there is, oh man, this is a doozy of a question. So I'll give you a couple of different perspectives. I'll give you the generous perspective and then the more cynical perspective. The generous perspective, and this is one that you actually see African Americans on both sides of the aisle. You see the NAACP, Roy Wilkins, for example, or Ralph Bunche, who calls himself a political independent at the time, are privately making this argument. But part of what African Americans are saying is that as a collective, they don't have individual rights. They don't have the ability to be treated as individuals because they're still being treated like second class. I have a constitutional, or I have a principal constitutional opposition to these aspects of the 1964 Civil Rights Conserve. The Roosevelt administration says we have to stand for something principal, which is that black voters, from a mathematical perspective, is being moved towards white Southern outreach. And so you really do have no business in the Republican Party. So we see the increase in influence in terms of John Birch Society. We see a moment where Barry Goldwater is called upon to disavow the support of the Ku Klux Klan and says, well, I'm not going to disavow any support. And it causes an uproar, and eventually he says, okay, I disavow it. But then is also going into Southern enclaves and going into these Southern areas and saying, look, I'm not going to change your way of life. States' rights is important to me, and therefore, who better than the South to decide what is best for the South? And so for African Americans, that's not just a dog whistle. Right? That's a megaphone saying, this is racism, and you have no place here. So where it really creates this, he has appeal for Democrats. He has appeal for Republicans. He has an appeal for black voters. He has appeal for Jewish voters, for Irish voters, for Italian voters. And what ends up happening in '64 is that in a moment where the party is in flux and Barry Goldwater becomes the nominee, Brooke becomes one of the most outspoken people who says, this is pseudo-conservatism. This is not real conservatism. And very loudly denounces and unapologetically denounces Goldwater. And ultimately what happens is when Goldwater loses in a landslide in '64, Brooke wins his re-election bid, again, with these numbers that are really unheard of. And it gives him the confidence to run for a Senate seat in 1966 and put into effect what I call progressive conservatism, or this idea that conservatives should have, or John F. Kennedy. Right? So he is up until this point within the party. Right? He's talked about as being Richard Nixon's potential vice presidential run. Have been a very different outcome for the Senate. On top of that, he's not just representing the to be in the Senate since Reconstruction. So I believe the last black senator leaves, I believe, in 1901. So he's elected in 1960, represents the forming Congress.
Then Richard Nixon comes around and runs his Southern strategy, and how effective was he at appealing to African Americans?
So good old Tricky Dick, right? So Richard Nixon, in terms of 8, are you looking at 60, 62, are you looking at 68? Richard has a back and forth relationship with Richard Nixon and is good friends with him. 62, Richard Nixon says, I would have won the 1960 election if I had done a better job reaching out to black voters. That the Republican Party, if it becomes the party, and this is 62, he says, if we become the party of Barry Goldwater and we go down that route, we will become an all-white party. We will become the white man's party. By 64, Richard Nixon has struck a deal where he is now saying, I'm going to support Barry Goldwater in the name of party unity, and also hedging his bets that Goldwater is going to lose, and this will put him in line for the presidency later on. And then by 68, we have the emergence of Richard Nixon, who is denouncing the riots that are sweeping the nation in the 1960s, who is denouncing the Kerner Commission report, right, which is the massive report that comes out in '68 that says that the nation is turning into 2 separate nations, one black, one white, unequal, and that white supremacy is at the root of unrest. So denouncing that, calling for law and order, making backroom deals with Strom Thurmond, right, who has crossed the aisle in 1964 to become a Republican, the former Dixiecrat nominee for president in 1948. But making backroom deals and saying, I'll honor whoever you want to appoint to the Supreme Court. I'll put your people in place. And so for African Americans, that is a complete just affront. So we see that Richard Nixon is failing miserably with black voters very early on in the campaign. Many of whom, including Jackie Robinson, this one staunch supporter, who says, if Richard Nixon becomes the party's nominee, I'll quit. I will leave the Republican Party forever. I am done. I will, he says, I won't go so far as to be a Democrat, but I'll be an independent, and this is just a line in the sand for me. The interesting thing, though, is that Ed Brooke is part of this group that decides, I want to work within the Republican Party, and I want to work with Richard Nixon, and he becomes an advisor to Richard Nixon. They have a very tumultuous relationship, including Ed Brooke storming off a plane and quitting as an advisor and saying, I can't talk to that man, and then 2 weeks later coming back. But one of the things that happens is that Richard Nixon, as shrewd as he is, as savvy as he is, realizes that there are multiple ways to talk to audiences. So what we see in 1968 actually isn't a Southern strategy per se, in the sense of kind of a racist segregationist campaign, but more so of a suburban strategy in terms of making these colorblind appeals, some of which have veiled appeals to white, middle-class, suburban, and working-class voters, but also making some appeals to black voters, particularly the black middle class. So we see in 1968 all of these ads and interviews that Richard Nixon does for magazines like Ebony and Jet, where he talks about figures like Homer Pitts. There's this wonderful, really wonderful ad about black capitalism where Richard Nixon is saying, vote like Homer's life depends on it, support black capitalism, support education. And there are a series of advertisements like this. There's a radio ad, Bridges to Human Dignity, where he talks about, again, this idea of black capitalism and pouring money into black, or this idea that he can.
Okay. One of the things that I think is important, there were a number of African Americans who served in cabinet roles under President Nixon, President Reagan, I think President Ford, President George H.W. Bush. Take a couple of them that you find most interesting and maybe give us some of the highlights about them and how they were selected.
Sure. So one thing I'll point out is Richard Nixon is, so the first black cabinet member of any presidential administration is Robert Weaver under Lyndon B. Johnson. He was appointed Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in 1966. And so after that, once that bar is set, it becomes the norm that the extra jobs or through the economy, that they in turn will be able to have whatever you want to call it, the freedom, the luxury to pursue their conservatism or their allegiance with the Republican Party, is the idea behind this kind of black capitalism sentiment that happens in this affirmative action moment. When I think about other cabinet members who are incredibly important, I definitely think we have to talk about Bill Coleman, who is the Secretary of Transportation under the Ford administration. And so one of the reasons, again, he decides to use the Department of Transportation as a vehicle for civil rights. And so partners with, say, something like the city of Atlanta, and that's how we get the Atlanta airport, right? So it's a partnership between these ideas of black capitalism, affirmative action, civil rights, but also economic uplift through the method of the market in order to build these massive projects. The person that I'll very quickly say, I also find Leon Sullivan in the Bush administration incredibly interesting, who's Secretary of Health and Human Services, in part because of these ideas that he has about universal health care in the 1980s. But the figure that I'm really interested in right now is actually Sam Pierce during the Reagan administration, who is Secretary of HUD, or Housing and Urban Development, from 1981 through 1989. And really has this long storied career before he comes into the White House as both representative, as a civil rights lawyer, as a corporate lawyer. He is, I'm not sure if you guys, many of you may have heard of Sullivan v. New York Times, a very famous libel speech or speech issue. Sam Pierce is actually the lawyer for the black ministers in the case, including Martin Luther King. And I encourage anybody who's interested to go out and read the argument that he makes in front of the Supreme Court about the dignity of humanity in terms of African American lives and freedom of speech. But has this really just fascinating career. He starts Freedom National Bank, which is, through the 90s, one of the most successful black and minority-owned and operated banks in the country, out of Harlem. Co-founds it with Jackie Robinson in 1964. It's a space where Martin Luther King puts his Nobel Peace Prize winnings in '64. He's also the figure who the FBI decides covertly, he doesn't know this, that he would be a great replacement in their campaign to discredit Martin Luther King Jr. Right? So this is the guy they suggest as the person to take his place. But he's got this really interesting history and involvement. And then, and I'm sure, Bill, you have your time in the Reagan administration. This must have been quite all over the place. But then becomes Secretary of HUD and attracts an enormous amount of attention and ultimately scandal after all of this news breaks about corruption in housing and urban development. One of the things that I'm working through now and some of the projects that I'm working on is how do we balance who Sam Pierce was prior to being in the administration, but then what are the actions that he does say around ideas of fair housing enforcement and pushing fair housing legislation in combination with ideas of corruption, rampant corruption that happens during his time in office. So there's really just a kind of a hodgepodge, but I think it's been standard for Republican administrations to have people of color. This is the norm in positions of power and policymaking positions.
Okay, I have one last question tonight, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, we'll have a couple of students who have cordless mics. Please wait for them to find you, and then you can ask your question in the mic so that we get it on, everybody can hear it, so we get it on our video. But Leah, let's suppose, this is a theoretical, I'm curious how you'll respond. Let's suppose you get a call tomorrow, and Senator Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Senate Majority Leader, Speaker Paul Ryan, want to meet with you in Washington next week and want to hear your historical perspective on what Republicans need to do to start rebuilding their relationships with African Americans. What would you tell them?
Ooh, how much coffee and how much alcohol do we have? Because it's going to be
We have
long
plenty. You take your time.
It's going to be a long time. You know, what's interesting is that I get a variation of this question a lot, and not just from audiences or talks or things like that, but from people who work in government, people who work in strategy, people on all sides of the aisle, voters, and things like that. And I think one of the things that struck me about the book through the present day is that the presence of people who understand what it would take to win back black voters within the Republican Party, there have always been those people. And they've always been vocal. They've always been writing. And in fact, Ralph Bunche lays out the blueprint for essentially what it would take in 1940, 1941. And so what we've seen is a variant of this in different respects. Some people get it better than others. And you'd be surprised at the people who really get it. I mean, Richard Nixon at one point understands it to the point where he can begin to make appointments and he can begin to invest money into these things. George H.W. Bush is instrumental in 1972 at pushing not just for the formation of the National Black Republican Association and auxiliary group of the RNC, but also for pushing for proactive plans, which are not affirmative action plans, but affirmative action light plans to integrate the Republican organizations on state and local levels in terms of minority members. So good faith efforts to do outreach for efforts. We see a lot of it in a lot of these things pinpointed in the Republican autopsy report, or the Growth and Opportunity Act report that comes out in 2012 and addendum in 2013. And there are steps occasionally, every once in a while, particularly after a massive loss, where the Republican Party will actually take concrete steps and invest money, policy, rhetoric, publicity, communications, PR, all of these things into transforming the party. The most recent version of this was that the RNC hired, a couple years ago, Orlando Watson, who no longer works for the RNC, to essentially maintain black media outreach and communications, and was actually making sturdy growth and making inroads in that area, but also doing long sustained interventions. So not coming along, Johnny-come-lately elections and saying, hey, how's it going? But actually doing something that involves years and years and years of groundwork. There's an organization, there was an organization, Wright McNeil and Associates, that had an incredible track record at winning black support for Republican candidates, including Newt Gingrich in 1978. And one of the things, if you go through their manual, if you go through their field notes, sometimes it was as simple as saying, we're going to teach our candidates how to go into black neighborhoods and shake black people's hands, which seems absolutely ridiculous. It seems so basic. But for a lot of the politicians that they worked with and that they consulted with, they had no idea that they actually had to invest real time and effort and money, and then come up with programs and policies that would be appealing to African Americans. So when we do see success, when we do see African Americans support Republicans on state and local level, and it does still happen even today, it tends to follow the same pattern, which is that you have a Republican politician who has an established relationship with black communities, right? So isn't a newcomer. Right? We have a Republican who he or she has managed to create an identity for himself or herself that is independent from the national organization, from the national party. So when a Republican who on a national scale does something very, very bad, the state or local Republican can say, well, that's not me, you know me. Right? And so there's a critical relationship there. And then the other part of this is that oftentimes these Republicans have actually put into place mechanisms whereby they listen to black audiences. So instead of going in, and this is a mistake I think we see a lot, instead of going in and lecturing at black audiences, right? One thing you should never do is talk about getting off the plantation. That is the absolute worst thing that you can do when you talk to black audiences, but it happens over and over and over again. I mean, we see politicians coming in and saying, I'm just here to listen. Talk to me. And then turning around and making changes, implementing policy that reflects on those things that African Americans have said that they wanted. And in this respect, African Americans are like any other constituency group. They want to see policies and they want to see rhetoric and engagement that affects their day-to-day lives. Now the difficulty in all of this is that because Republicans and black people have this relationship that right now is virtually non-existent, the Republican Party is always going to be judged by the actions of its worst member. And so what happened in 2016 is that the party, and there was a lot of, for those of you who kept up with the debates and the primaries on the Republican side of things, there was a lot of talk about who do we want to be the face? Who do we want to represent the Republican Party? And there was a moment, I don't know if you guys remember, where Marco Rubio was up on stage and Tim Scott is standing next to him and Nikki Haley and someone, conservative website, I think it might have been Daily Wire or something like that, or Daily Caller said, this is the future of the Republican Party. This is a diverse future. And one of the reflections of this kind of moment, is actually some of the things in the Growth and Opportunity Report being put into effect. But instead, what happens? The nominee is Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, across polling, in terms of black voter polling, on every single level, is the candidate that is the furthest from where you want to be if you want to bring African Americans back into the party. Now I'll add one caveat. Somebody threw me a couple months ago. Somebody threw me a curveball and said, "Okay, you're saying it's policy, it's rhetoric, it's action. Is there anything that, say, the current administration could do that would bring black voters into the party en masse?" And I said, it would have to be something along the scale of the New Deal. It would have to be something so transformational, so momentous, so off the beaten path, that it would dispel everything else, or at least, African Americans would be able to put aside everything else because that thing made it possible for them to support it. So I said, something like universal health care, free health care for all is the kind of thing that might actually spark a real change. And right now, we're in a moment where that's not looking too great on a national level.
Okay, very good. I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We have a question, have a couple questions. Oh, we got a whole bunch of them. We'll take as much time as we need, so we'll start right here.
All right, thank you very much for joining us this evening. My question is, I was wondering if you could comment on the current unemployment numbers in the African American community, which the Trump administration is heralding, or keeps heralding as historically low, and specifically, how do you think the narrative around black unemployment will play in the 2018 and 2020 cycles?
Hey, that is although they haven't been, they haven't a number good for us. I want to go back for a second, because one of the things that the Trump campaign did during the 2016 election that was actually far more effective than people acknowledged is that they hit on those unemployment numbers, and they also hit on underemployment and stagnation and lack of mobility. Now, African Americans, by and large, reacted viscerally to Donald Trump talking about it. Right? So we all remember those moments where he said, told an audience of largely white people, Africa is understood, that they were frustrated. We saw red flags all over the place, particularly in terms of worker strikes, in terms of not just Black Lives Matter. Can't sugarcoat the fact that African Americans are not doing well. This is not a bad number in the large scale. But then that didn't jive with what was happening on the micro, on the ground. So what you would hear is, say, this really kind of terrific number, and then on the ground, Black people were saying, I can't afford to feed my children. I'm living in poverty. The gap between, not just the black-white wealth gap is increasing, the gap between the black middle class and the black poor has grown exponentially. So there are all of these signs and all of these people saying this, but the macro is painting a pretty rosy picture. So what you have is people saying, we're doing great. America is great already. And then you have somebody who's coming in, and there's one person I didn't interview, one person said, he was the wrong messenger to say it, but a broken clock is right twice a day, who is hitting on these things that have real currency within these communities. Now, they don't translate into votes for, say, Donald Trump, but for the Democratic Party, right, in terms of turnout. Now, that there's a gap, that there is no social mobility, so I may have a job, but I don't have benefits, I can't live, I'm living in poverty, all of the argument that we would think in terms of reaching out to Black voters. Now, I'll close by saying this, I do think it is something that amongst Trump supporters is something that has currency. So it becomes another example of say, hey, look, our guy did this, even if it doesn't necessarily match up with the reality on the ground.
Okay, we have a question right here. Our next one's right here, Alex, and then the gentleman behind you as well.
What do you see right now today as the connection between whatever the face of the Republican Party is and the people of color vote? I know it must be changing, but how much is it changing, and where do you see it going in the near future?
Sure. So this is not a good time for the relationship between people of color and the Republican Party. which is that the relationship between voters of color, racial minorities, and ethnic minorities, and the Republican Party is in a very, very bad place. The 2016 election in the last 2 years, or last 18 months, has made that exponentially worse. And new poll numbers that have actually just come out corroborate that and back that up. And so just to give you, I mean, one of the things that we're seeing with Latino voters and Asian American voters is that they are increasingly looking like black voters in 1964, 1968, right? These years where black voters are moving away from the party. You know, Ronald Reagan did exceptionally well with Asian American voters in the 1980 and 84 election. Asian American voters since 2008 have been the racial group that that the Republican Party have absolutely, you know, lost in record numbers. So, you know, in 2007, you could actually count on Asian American voters being Republican voters. Now the reverse is true. You can count on Asian American voters being Democratic voters. So if I'm a Republican strategist, if I am, you know, a politician at the national level, I'm tearing my hair out, because what that signals is that there's a message. You will have a party that is made up of this kind of multicultural coalition, and a party that is made up of overwhelmingly white older voters, and that's not good for democracy. That's not good for competition. Now the problem, though, is geographical representation, which is that politicians, officials, you're siloed. You're in your area. You only have to really cater to your constituents. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to perform for a larger audience. And again, this comes out to this kind of mathematical, you know, these calculations that people are making, which is a lot. You do see a lot of cynical decisions being made in areas where people say, I don't have to care about Asian voters. I don't have to care about Latino voters. I don't have to care about black voters. So why should they factor in an impactful section of the population, and the state and local are out of whack? You're going to continue.
Hi, can I assume you're a Republican?
I am not.
You are not, okay.
Oh.
How do you think traditional Republicans can?
I'd push back a little bit and say that in the past, with the exception of the infrastructure conversation and the tariffs, with that said, on the vast majority of things, he votes with, you know, he does not toe the party line, and has been pretty interesting on this. And Paul Ryan particularly, have been pretty shrewd on this, which is, you know, we're going to support what the president wants to do, particularly since we have our own agendas that we need to get through. So in a lot of ways, there are parallels to the Carter administration, right? So somebody coming in who is essentially a political outsider and having to navigate. I thought you were asking is there a way to support the administration by trying to work from the inside in order to push? I mean, it's been a pretty chaotic couple of years, and so increasingly the baseline is, you know, those kinds of people are either being forced out or are leaving of their own accord. So.
Okay, we have a question back here.
Thank you for your presentation. This is fantastic talk. Recently, through the public sphere, I witnessed like similarities or crossovers between both black Democrats and black Republicans who, for example, overwhelmingly agreed on Harriet Tubman appearing on the $20 bill, which I found interesting in Facebook pages with both had Harriet Tubman, you know, appearing in a $20 bill, which I found like an interesting nuance. And So based on your talk in regards to Ed Brooke and his participation in the Civil Rights Act and the Housing Act as well, why do you believe the history of black Republicans is either minimized or ignored in black American history and media?
So it feels like there's almost two questions in that kind of comment.
And the reason I was saying that is because I started thinking about more nuances. For example, when we think about like immigration restriction, people usually associate that with political ideologies with white Republicans, but then I think about Barbara Jordan, right, who was on the one hand a fierce civil rights lawyer, but on the other hand, who also enforced immigration restriction, right, and these kind of political nuances that I feel are either black or white within the public sphere and institutions of knowledge.
Sure. So one of the things that I talk about in the book, particularly in the end of the book, is the way in which black politics, as it is emerging, is modern black politics as is coming of age, is becoming something. Black Republicans actually end up influencing not just, say, black neoconservatism or black conservatism, but also black liberalism and black neoliberalism. So the model, so I use Barack Obama, for example. Barack Obama's social justice, capitalism methodology or approach is very much rooted, and he says this explicitly, is very much rooted in Ed Brooke's approach. He gets it from, right, and he says, if I were, at one point he says, if I came of age in the 1960s, I would have been an Ed Brooke Republican. I would have been a Rockefeller Republican. I would have been a George H.W. Bush Republican. So there are very much strains that are crossing lines and crossing boundaries, even to this day, that partisanship obscures. So there are areas of overlap that, I tell my students, I call them, strange bedfellows. But actually they're not really that strange, because they're only strange because we have a two-party system and we divide everything into binaries. But the truth is, when we talk about, say, something like Ferguson, who's one of the first politicians to go down to Ferguson and kind of denounce what's going on? It's not Claire McCaskill. It's actually, it's Rand Paul, which makes it organic. I mean, it is organic. It's a natural overlap. In the same way that on the left, your example of Barbara, that we prescribe to them because of partisans or where they stand on very specific issues. So this is one of the reasons that we're, in 2015, able to come to this really fragile, bipartisan, agreement on mass, because there are strains and overlaps that, go through conservative and liberal ideology and bring the default to either placing it aside or saying something like this is tokenism, that it doesn't have value. What I wanted to do with this project is take race and conservatism and the intersection of the two very, very seriously, without reducing it to something, saying, okay, well, this is just tokenism, right, and writing it off. In part because there are very real consequences, but then also, too, there are very, for example, we know that Southern black women, right, who are perhaps the most radical in terms of their voting patterns, views that line up pretty nicely and neatly with where you would think they would be in the Republican Party. But we don't have a frame for talking about that. Now, with that said, one of the things that happens, particularly begins to happen in right around the era of Goldwater, is that once we have this moment where people are in particular segments of the party are in power, black people and black Republicans quickly learn that there is no reward for speaking out against those that are in power. So I've mentioned Jackie Robinson a couple of different times. Jackie Robinson is an outspoken critic of the Republican Party, even as he is a Republican. And he sees no value from that. There's nothing to be gained from him speaking out. right? In some senses, he is, aside from, his pride or, saying this is the right or moral thing to do. But in terms of policy, right, he has no effect on policy in the immediate. Right? He's not put into policy-making positions outside of Nelson Rockefeller's administration, and even then they're a party. And so what people around him quickly realize, I think during the Republican primaries, almost all of the candidates understood, they didn't necessarily know why, but almost all of them understood that black women were an important part of the political process. So if you wanted legitimacy, if you wanted validation from larger audiences of all races, get a black woman and put a black woman out front. Now, a lot of these black women, right, are qualified, are doing the damn thing, are very much deserving of being there. And then you have other people who are put out front, who are thrust out front, right, in a way where you say, well, what value are you bringing to this? And the one that, the one that everyone, notices is somebody like Diamond and Silk, right? You say, and these are women who go on the road for Donald Trump and basically have a back and forth dialogue about why they love Donald Trump. But the interesting thing there is they say, well, we're not here for policy. We're not here to discuss those issues. We're here to have a good time. We're here to da-da-da-da-da-da. But in what way is that representative of the issues that are supposed to be central to these various political campaigns? And so this is where it gets dicey, because what I don't want to do is suggest that overwhelmingly it's just that. Because there are people who are conservative, who are very much involved in these worlds in very qualified and important ways. But at the same time, correspondence amongst various Republicans at different levels. Some of them have been very, very critical of this idea of Tobitization, including. So he gives this 1987 speech to the Heritage Foundation, which actually the title of my book is a play on this speech, where he says, I am sick of being dragged out, right, and other black conservatives are sick of being dragged out to basically play the fool, shuck and jive, and step and jive and play the clown and play the buffoon. So he's calling it out and saying this is not a sustained or real thing, but instead something that we have to recognize and address. So.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions. We're going to start with this one right here, and then we'll go right here.
I can sit. Thank you very much for really clarifying a lot of things. But I want to take you back south a bit, my own bias, and
every single chapter of the book, I can document it through the present. The idea of the black middle class that is connected to the Republican Party can expand the black middle class, and this group, then of course the rest of that group will then vote for us. And so in some ways it is an interesting poll, and actually Ronald Reagan's individual, and in fact has a whole series of targeted campaigns that is of African Americans who are supporting the Republican Party through the 1980s through present day. But again, in those moments where we do see the support go up, they're drawn from a very particular background. Now, a black Trump supporter, right? What would a black Trump supporter look like? Or what did a black Trump supporter look like? It was a black man between the ages of roughly 34 to 45 from there's a wrinkle, but I think it's very much in line with some other things.
Okay, last question.
Oh, wow. Hello, thank you. This has been, I know, right? This is actually a very informative program. I have to get my phone to open up. So the country is getting more diverse, and the Republicans have shifted to more of a suppression strategy than over outreach. And this, and now the Democratic Party tends to only do outreach during election years, and they're not really doing like a lot of building amongst.
Consistently as a bloc, it's just that African Americans are the most partisan of any racial, ethnic group or interest. And so one of the things that we see, though, and that I think is really, really important to emphasize, is that even as African Americans are a captured constituency, we constantly see African Americans trying to fight back against that. So pushing back against that. So when I am, right, and he explicitly says, one party that is, takes black people for granted, the other party that writes you off, that's political genocide for black people. And he says, so a group of people that is irrelevant is incredibly dangerous. So what we see, and again, we see this again in 1984 with Jesse Jackson, we see it in 88 when he tries to, again, leverage within the Democratic Party as running as, almost as an independent candidate, but within the Democratic infrastructure, is pushing back. The problem is that the stakes are incredibly high, which means, and so we see it with Republicans, black Republicans, the 1976 election, threatened to vote in his favor. He would have become the nominee, and et cetera, et cetera. The black delegates couldn't do it in 76. They could do it in 80. By 80, they were ready to do it. 76, they just could not do it because they said they didn't want to take the risk. Down to it, I believe only one black delegate, Gloria Toot, actually goes over and crosses and says, I'm going to vote for Ronald Reagan. And so we see a lot of this happening within these two-party systems. This is something that we should look at in the 2016 election, right? What does it mean that there is a drop when Michael Dukakis becomes the nominee? Right? A drop of 5% then may have actually cost Dukakis the election. So what does it say about the role of these individuals? I think one of the things that is happening right now is that in their attempts to leverage their political power, black voters are trying to put the onus back on the two-party political system. And again, that is really hard to do. It is really risky, just in terms of the way that resources are allocated, party infrastructure. Right? There's not a lot of, I know a lot of you guys are in a study group that talks about independence and a national third-party movement. But oftentimes, those third-party movements are not necessarily about getting something, right, that party winning, but instead forcing concessions from the two major political parties. So my guess is, within the Democratic Party, from black voters saying, take us, don't take us for toss-up. These minority groups, these black voter groups, are working within the Democratic Party and trying to force concessions from them, particularly by pointing out, if you don't do what we need you to do, we just won't vote. We won't come out and we won't support you.
Okay, Leah, thank you so much for coming.